In addition, he does research through Millersville Center for Disaster Research and Education. His research includes issues involving leadership and disaster preparedness. He's been working and volunteering in the field of emergency management for over 20 years. He retired in 2011 from the City of Lancaster Bureau of Fire, where he held numerous positions, including Emergency Management Coordinator. Duane currently serves on the South Central PA Counterterrorism Task Force and 8-County Regional Emergency Management Task Force. As a member of this task force, he was one of the responders to the 2006 Nickel Mines Amish school shooting. Duane has given presentations both nationally and regionally. He has numerous local, state, and federal certifications and sits on various emergency management committees, including the chair of the IAEM Training and Education Committee, the Conference Committee, the Government Affairs Committee, and the Children Disasters Caucus. He is also the co-chair of Millersville University's COVID response team. I think that's the correct title for it. It has some other title. And then next we have Flora Cardoni. Flora is Penn Environment's field director. In this role, she leads the organization's grassroots and field operations, working to mobilize activists and volunteers across the state to fight climate change and promote clean energy, clean up our air and water, eliminate single-use plastics, and hold big polluters accountable. Thank you for being with us, Flora. And finally, we have Dr. Ruth McDermott Levy. Dr. Levy is an associate professor at Villanova University's M. Louise Fitzpatrick College of Nursing, and she is also the co-director of the Mid-Atlantic Center for Children's Health and Environment. She has extensive community health nursing practice. Ruth served as the director of the College of Nursing Center for Global and Public Health for 6 years. She's worked with Arab immigrant families in Philadelphia and families living in fracking communities in northeastern Pennsylvania to study, educate, and reduce environmental health risks for each group. She is recognized as an expert in environmental health nursing education, has authored numerous publications regarding implementation of environmental and climate health into nursing curricula. She's the editor of the 2017 American Journal of Nursing Awarded Book of the Year, Environmental Health and Nursing. And that is available online on the Annie website, and there's a new edition coming out before too long, I believe. And in 2018, Ruth lived in Finland as a Fulbright Foundation Health and Environmental Science Scholar, and she conducted research and also taught at the University of Eastern Finland, and it was great fun to watch that happen via Facebook, at least. She's been an invited speaker at the Global Climate and Health Summit in Poland in 2018, as well as at the International Nurses Day at the United Nations in 2019. In 2020, she was awarded the prestigious Charlotte Brody Award for Environmental Health Nursing Leadership, as well as the Sigma Theta Tau International Alpha Nu Chapter Excellence in Nursing Leadership Award. Ruth is committed to assuring healthy environments for children and their families, as well as, and I can say from personal experience, bringing other people into that commitment and really energizing other people about the importance of climate and health and that interplay. So with that said, welcome everyone. So it's my pleasure that I get to ask questions and all of you get to respond. So this is great for me. So one of the first questions that I have for all of you and for the people in the audience, you can put questions in the chat. We will monitor that. And after we go have some conversation with the panelists, we will have open discussion for people in the chat. But if they say something while they're answering the questions that you'd like to follow up on, please just put that in the chat and we can do that. So my first question, and one of the first things that really struck me about the film was at the very beginning of the film, the narrator poses the question, what is the best way to prepare for a disaster? And at the end of the film, she leaves us with that same question, but she follows up with, or recover from one, because obviously disasters will happen, but we have to not only prepare, but we also have to figure out how to come out on the other side of that. So I'd like each of you to answer this question from your unique perspective. So we have public health policy, emergency management, and climate change. And I see that Ruth has her mute off, so I'm going to go to her first.
Oh man, right. So it's up to me with all these disaster preparedness experts. You know, I found that question quite moving as well. And really, I think we need resilient communities, and the people that were interviewed during the film didn't use those words, but they alluded to it, that we are spending our money in the wrong places, and we are not building resilient communities. However, the low income communities that were there are personally resilient in that. Now there's health effects of all the discrimination that they're experiencing and the structural violence that they're experiencing, but they kept moving and kept working forward. So if we invest in those communities, imagine how far they can go. And so I think that's, you know, in public health, we're always prevention. We think first of, and actually it saves money. If we spend money on prevention, we can go much further and don't have these big events. But I will now go to the disaster experts, because that I am not that.
So Duane, I'll come to you next, because I think, you know, you have a unique perspective of doing lots of emergency preparedness and teaching classes on this.
Yes, so thank you. So my take on it was, and we'll get into how it relates to the film later, but I looked at this question more from the traditional standpoint, right? So I'm the traditional emergency manager, and you know, emergency management and disaster preparedness is all about personal responsibility. It was kind of interesting because the gentleman said about pulling your bootstraps up, which I thought was, he was going to eat those words later, and he did. She brought that back out to him. But, you know, traditionally, you know, government can only do so much, and we'll explain later why they need to do more in this area. But from a disaster preparedness standpoint, you know, individuals need to take responsibility, and they need to be able to help themselves where they can, so that government can then help those that can't take care of themselves. So, you know, as we saw in the film, there are a lot of people that just don't have the means to help themselves. So if those of us that can take care of ourselves, then we're not relying on government. Resiliency is the perfect word. We have to be resilient. It's interesting because they talk about recovery. And again, I'm talking from the traditional disaster preparedness standpoint. Recovery starts before a disaster. You know, you need to start that process now before something happens. To Ruth's point about being resilient, the more resilient we are, the better our chances to recover, because we have those systems in place ahead of time. So my you know, my textbook answer of disaster preparedness is that it's an individual thing that we all have to take responsibility for. We have to help our neighbors. We have to help our communities. We can't be overly reliant on government for this. And then, as I'll talk about later, government has certainly let us down in lots of areas. So thank you.
So Flora, I think that sort of flows into your area, and then we'll finish up this question with Dr. Yalda. But so from a policy standpoint, what more do we need to do, or what is the best answer to that question?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And I think it's interesting because the way I think about this problem is almost the opposite of Duane, where the government should be doing so much more to help people. And I think both, right, preparing for the disasters that we know are coming. You know, as climate change is worsening, we know we're going to have more extreme heat days and heat waves. We know that because of the urban heat island effect, poor communities of color, our cities are going to have even hotter temperatures than rural areas, worsening air quality. And certainly there are things that municipal governments can have in place to help those people when that happens, which we know it will, and we know it'll just get worse every summer. So, you know, there's things like doing more, and we'll go into specific policies more later, I'm sure, but you know, there's things that we can do in our cities, like planting more street trees, more green spaces, making sure there's cooling centers in these neighborhoods so that people do have somewhere to go when it's too hot. Planning so that when there's a pandemic and a heat wave, people have places to go that are safe, and we're not, you know, closing all our cooling centers down. But when I first read the question, I, you know, thought about preparing for the disasters we know are coming. We need to try to stop the disasters from getting worse. And I know with climate change, that's something I think about a lot, right? So we know we have extreme weather events and we know we have extreme heat waves we can prepare for. But with climate change, we know those things will only get worse, increase in frequency and intensity. And so when I think about policy, I think about starting way at the front end and doing what we can now to stop those impacts from getting worse in the first place by tackling climate change and moving away from fossil fuels to clean energy as one example. So of course, there's lots of points of intervention, but I definitely think that there's more that the government can be doing at every level, certainly.
Great, thank you. And Sepi, how about your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with actually all three. So I'm going to come at it from a science perspective. And I have just a couple of slides, and I think that will put some numbers into what Flora said and actually what has been said about resiliency. So just going to share a couple of slides. I promise it won't be too long. So I hope you're able to see my screen here. And I just wanted to show a couple of things here in terms of what's happening with temperatures. So I hope you're able to see this. So 2020 actually came in second as the warmest year on record. It was tied with 2016, but December ended up being a little bit different. So one of the things that Flora pointed out accurately is that we do need to think about, and sorry, this is a little bit slow, but now you can see the animation, hopefully. So if you keep your eye on United States, and as the months go by, you can really see those departures in temperature. And of course, we can't take 1 year and use that as a way to know what's going to happen in the future. But my perspective on this is that science can really guide us and inform us and in our process of preparation and mitigation. It can really help us to understand what we can expect to have. So just wanted to build a perspective that we can't just take 1 year as a way to describe what has been happening. If you look at the 7 warmest years on record have occurred in the last few years, the top 10 have all been, in this century. So that's really important. And I think this last point that this was the 44th consecutive year with global temperatures being above 20th century. So that's, pretty hot, right? So that's why I put disco fever here, right? It's a good perspective. And really the only thing you want to look at here is the fact that all the models are kind of projecting warmer temperatures, right? So it's a complicated graph, but that's all we want to look at, right? So we kind of have our observations and we can see that our models are doing a pretty good job of telling us what has happened in the past. So that means we can depend on what they're telling us is going to happen in the future. And you can see these increasing trends if you look at the temperatures. And of course, as it has been pointed out in the film, but also by our other panelists, is that we are expecting to see some impacts, differences in high impact weather events or extreme events. But also we're seeing these in both the mean and extreme temperatures, and that's really important. So not only our day-to-day temperatures are getting warmer, but also in terms of those extreme events like the heat wave event that we saw in the film. What's really important to note is that most studies are showing that we're going to see not only increased frequency, intensity, but also duration of these events. And that's really important when we look at these types of events. And I'll just share with you really quickly, this was an interesting study that was done almost 10 years ago by Hagelgans et al. And it was an analog study, and it basically looked at, the European heat wave of 2003. And they said if an event of that scale, if you put it into a place like Chicago, like we saw in the film, what would happen? And you can see the numbers in terms of heat-related death, but over just a few weeks. So it's really important to kind of think about that we are more and more likely, especially if there are no mitigation efforts and if we continue to do business as usual, what we're likely to see is more and more of these events by middle of the century and then moving on into the future. So that's a very important point to keep in mind. So really these preventative mitigation and responsive adaptation are going to be really important in terms of reducing vulnerability, not just in Chicago, but in other places. And I'll end, I promise this is my last slide, but since resilience was mentioned, I did want to say that it's really important more and more now that both in emergency management and climate change, we're really looking at disaster risk reduction. So many of you may have heard of the Sendai framework. So many of these things that have been mentioned by other panelists, so resilient infrastructure, whether it's early warning and early action, some of the actions that can deal with employment and poverty reduction, urban resiliency, securing water. There are a few more. I haven't listed all of them. But this idea that science can inform and guide our decision-making, and we can make well-informed decisions based on scientific facts and can address many of these problems. So I hope that helps. Thank you, and I'll stop share.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sepi, because I think that it's really important that we look at that science and that we understand that even in your graph where it showed that, the low emission scenario, which we're not at that yet. And Flora, I'm sure could share that because I know I've done some work with her on emission things in Pennsylvania. Even at that low emission level, we're still seeing some dramatic increases in overall temperature change. So most, I don't actually know, I shouldn't say most, I'm assuming many of the people on the webinar are social work students and nursing students. Special shout out to my students who were supposed to be in class with me tonight, but instead they got to do this. For those populations, the idea of social justice and social determinants of health is really important. And that really was one of the primary tenets, or one of the things that I really took away from the film. So I'm going to ask Dr. Levy if she can review and reinforce some of the ideas and the importance of the tenets of social justice and social determinants of health. And then I'll ask each panel to think about how we approach those issues from each of their perspectives, and maybe how they've seen the problems with social determinants of health play out in their own experiences. So I'll go to Dr. Levy.
Thanks, Kelly. So when I talk about the social determinants of health, I always say it's what we're born into instead of what we're born with, meaning that, we're born with a certain genetic code and our gender and our physical being. But there are things, and we saw in the film, the things that we are born into is where we live. And where we live influences our education, because even in the film you saw the quality of the school, where the children had to walk by boarded up schools. And I can only imagine what kind of funding the schools were getting if they didn't think the community was important enough. So, and then if our education, so that's one determinant, social determinant of health, but if our education is not of the quality of other people, then it can affect our income, a second determinant of health. And then our income can influence the food we can buy, the opportunities as far as access to healthcare, and then the education also influences our employment. So all of those things come together to be social determinants of health. And again, where we live really matters, and we see it played out all the time in communities, and it is a social justice issue, and it is a policy issue because of historically the things that have happened with redlining that was referred to in the video. And when they showed the film, but when they showed the veteran, I'm always reminded of the GI Bill, which I am a a direct recipient of, because my father and father-in-law fought in World War II, two white men, and they were allowed, when they came back, the GI Bill was available to everyone, but and so whether you're black or white, you had that availability, except for they made it much more challenging for black men to be able to access the loans, the federally qualified loans, and higher education. My father would have never been able to go to college without the GI Bill. So we have these structural things that also have then gone on and influenced the social determinants. So it is this long process. So I'm going to call Duane out just a little bit, but I think he is going to redeem himself, of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. If there's no straps to the boots, we've created these barriers, we can't be finger pointing so much. And what we've learned from COVID-19 and what we have transitioned to in public health, I hear the conversation much more, is not blaming individuals as much, looking at what are the barriers for individuals. And there are many, and we saw that in the film. So I hope I answered the question. It kind of overlaps social justice and the social determinants of health. But the last thing I want to say is about social determinants of health is I do have some data, just a little bit, is when they break it down, because most healthcare systems talk about the physical things. It's quick to fit, we can give somebody a pill for it. It's really quick. It's kind of sexy when you think of all the machines we can attach people to. But, and even in the film, they showed the challenges of how to address all these long-term social problems. But when we break it down and when we look at the health impacts of individuals and communities related to the determinants of health, all the things that influence our health, our medical care is 10 to 20%. Our genetics is 30%, but our health behaviors, which would be influenced by culture and those social determinants, and our physical and social environment, again, social determinants, are the remaining 60 to 70% of our health. So if you want to influence the health of a population, we need to go after those very difficult targets. And I will pass it on.
Well, Ruth, I just want to follow up a little bit. So would your education, where in the social determinants is, because I know I've always heard that your educational level also has is one of the most significant impacts on health as well.
Right.
So does that fit into that physical environment area?
Or the social environment, yes. It would
Social environment.
And it also would influence your behavior, because people make better, the more educated people are, there is a relationship between making better health choices. People don't, higher educated people tend to drink less, tend to smoke less. And so the health behaviors tend to be a little more health protective.
Very good. Is there anyone of the panelists? Flora has her mute off, so I'm going to go to Flora next. You guys are making this so easy.
Yes, thank you. I mean, of course, Ruth covered it all, but there's a few ways that, this plays out that we see in our work at Penn Environment and in the larger environmental movement, especially as it relates to climate change, right? So across the country, time and time again, low-income communities and communities of color are more likely to bear the brunt of fossil fuel and industrial pollution, coal plants, gas plants, highways cutting through neighborhoods, leading to disproportionate asthma rates, respiratory illnesses, more likely to experience the negative impacts of climate change, like extreme heat we saw in the movie, but also, with increasing downpours and flash flooding, more likely to have flooding in their homes, leaking, toxic mold. And I think, when I was prepping for this panel and looking at this movie, I was looking into, how that plays out where I live in Philadelphia. And already Philadelphia, majority of Black city, is often 3.8 degrees hotter on average than rural areas of the state, can be up to 21 degrees hotter. And it's even worse in certain neighborhoods, namely the low-income neighborhoods in the city, because of redlining, racist urban planning. So these neighborhoods have fewer trees, less green space, more exposed asphalt, more black roofs, all of which decrease shade and increase temperature. And whereas, the wealthier, whiter neighborhoods in Philly have more street trees and are much cooler. And that's just one example, you know, in one city, but that's happening all across the country. And certainly if folks are interested in how that plays out in Philly, I have, I'll put an article in the chat. And again, that's just one example, but the fossil fuel pollution and then the climate impacts that drive certainly have disproportionate impacts across race and class.
Thank you. Duane or Sepi, anything that you'd like to add?
Well, I've been taking a couple shots here. I feel like I'm rocking. Just to defend myself, I want to say that my point was that those that can pull themselves up should, so that government can then help those that can't. So I was not saying government should not help, but you know, I'll look at this from a disaster standpoint, going to what Ruth said, is that, you know, you already have poor health, you already have, you know, poor eating habits, you have poor neighborhoods, as was mentioned, you have, you know, the chance for flash flooding and all that. And now you have a disaster, whatever the disaster is, whether it's a heat disaster, it's Katrina, as we saw in the movie. The reality of it is, you know, the cards just keep getting stacked higher and higher against these populations. I always say in our classes, to defend myself again, and I have students here that defend me, that those that are most vulnerable are also those that pay the highest price every time there's a disaster. So, you know, you already have probably, again, as to feed off what Ruth was saying, you know, they don't, you know, possibly don't eat well, and you have, you know, they drink more and smoke more, and you have health issues. We saw in the film where she was offered the mammogram and she was like, well, I don't know if I want it. So you have all that. Now you have a disaster, and then you have technology, and going again to Ruth's point about education. You know, if you don't understand how to use the technology, and now the government comes in with all their technology and says, hey, fill out these forms on the computer, blah blah blah, and they have no clue what to do. So we're vulnerable, stacking vulnerable on top of it. A disaster strikes. And again, I mean, we see it. I mean, you can go to New Orleans today, you know, and you'll see there's areas that look the same as they did 15 years ago. It's just a compound effect that goes on and on and on. And so when we have people that shouldn't need government help, that rely on government help, that takes away from those that should be getting the government help. So I want to redeem myself. I'll pass it to Sepi if she has anything to add. She has not picked on me yet, so we're still good.
I don't think anybody's picking on you, Duane. I'll defend you as well. Duane's an all-around good guy. And
I think I hear a trumpet playing in the background at your house. Is that correct?
Yeah, I apologize. There was a trumpet lesson going on. I think it has finally finished. So I apologize. It was a little background music for everyone. The other I know I'm supposed to be a panelist, so I'm not a panelist, I'm a moderator, but I do have to, the nursing theorist in me, I'm not a theorist, but the nursing theory lover in me comes out. And I think, and it's not a nursing theory, but I think about Bowen's family systems theory, and he talked about the fact that people who have a lot, oh, the trumpet's starting up again, my apologies. People who have a lot of stress in their life, you know, he called them undifferentiated, and that when you add more stress, their bucket just overflows right away. They don't have any room to add stress. And so you have to, you know, that's one of those things from a public health perspective and from a social work perspective and from an emergency management perspective. How do we help people decrease that pre-existing stress so that they can have a little more resilience? And I think we're hearing more and more about resilience. For a long time, we were talking about burnout and compassion fatigue, and now we're starting to talk more about moral resilience. So how do we build that? So I will go to Sepi for her thoughts on this question.
Oh, I don't know if I have much to add here. All I want to say is that every time I teach my climate course, I have a map of the world and I show where are all the areas that are impacted. And one of the first things that we say is that climate change is unfair. And I think that it kind of goes back to disasters are unfair, and those populations that are most vulnerable are affected the most. So I don't know how much more I have to add on this, but I want to go back to the idea of if we can build the infrastructure for disaster risk reduction, we can kind of slowly chip away at it. There are no magic solutions.
It certainly isn't a problem that's occurred overnight. I swear every time I come off mute, that's when he starts to play. He's quiet, and then I come off mute, and it starts again. So I'll get off my mic quickly. So another question that I had, and this is a conversation I've had with Sepi and with Duane individually from a university standpoint, but what is the interplay between public health and emergency management and preparedness? And how do the four of you, coming at it from obviously different perspectives, but having very similar views, how do you see all of us on this call, whether it be emergency management, social workers, nurses, policy experts, how do you see us coming together and having a more collaborative approach? Anyone can go first. Bruce Hoffman.
Seems
Go
like
ahead,
a
Duane.
management question, right? So emergency management, we always talk about the 4 C's, and collaboration is the first one. And, emergency management really came upon itself after 9/11 because of the lack of coordination between a lot of the response agencies. And so public health, for whatever strange reason, is still kind of seen as the outlier. Maybe because for the most part, it's not a response agency, so that's why it's out there. We certainly see it in COVID, what's happening around the nation. We see it in Pennsylvania. COVID, as you know, from the university, you mentioned this earlier, Sepi and I serve on our incident management team. We are operating like it is a disaster. Surprise, it is. It's a public health emergency that's a disaster. People are dying, people, need the vaccine, they need healthcare, and it's not well coordinated. And from a emergency management and public health standpoint, we need to figure out either A, how to get emergency managers to work closer with public health, or B, get public health to understand that a pandemic is a disaster, and a disaster requires proper management. And that's what emergency managers do. And I think that that's where we're letting our citizens down, because we, for whatever strange reason, we go, well, it's a public health emergency. Well, it's what's the difference between a public health emergency and a tornado or a flood or a hurricane that kills lots and lots of people? It's still an event that needs managed. It's the largest event certainly in our lifetime, and hopefully will be the largest event ever in our lifetime. So we just need to, for whatever strange reason, we deal with emergency medical services on the street, and we deal with hospitals. And when we do exercises and drills, the firefighters, police officers, the EMTs, the paramedics, the nurses, the doctors, they're all working together. But for whatever strange reason, public health is still this kind of outlier over here. Although in Pennsylvania, they occupy the same building as the Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency. But for whatever strange reason, they're just, and maybe just because we haven't had a big pandemic in our lifetime. I don't know what it is, but it's and I'm using Pennsylvania as an example, but there's other places it's just as poorly run. So I'll stop now, because I could talk about this one all day.
So Ruth, I'm gonna go over to you, because I think, I have my own thoughts, but I'm gonna go to the expert.
No, I agree. We don't seem to play in the same sandbox, and we have to. But I think to Duane's point of how absent and quiet public health is in Pennsylvania, it's because we've been so awfully underfunded. Because if public health is working, no one pays attention to it. And then they say, well, we don't need it. National fiasco is a good example of, we don't need these things. And so we'll just, take those items off the budget. And it's happened at the local level, state and national level. And so public health is scrambling right now. And you see it, in the way the vaccines are being administered, and hopefully now everyone on this call will realize, as voters and taxpayers, how important it is. And disasters are part of public health. And so we do need to cooperate. But I just think even on a good day, the Pennsylvania Health Department is just managing, treading water.
Yeah, I would say, I would just add to this, and then Flora and Sepi can chime in. We have a healthcare system that is based on getting paid to treat people. So it is more profitable to treat someone who's sick than it is to keep someone from getting sick. and Ruth said this earlier, is that public health is all about prevention. And so when public health is working well, you don't necessarily notice because people are doing better. And so that's not, to use Ruth's word, that's not the sexy part of healthcare. The sexy part of healthcare is finding a new treatment for cancer or something like that. And so I do think that it's very systemic in terms of it has its roots in even just the way our healthcare system functions in this world. So Flora.
I mean, you all definitely covered it, but I'll just add that, you know, in my work as an environmental advocate, the intersections between all of these things are so clear every day. Environmental impacts on public health, you know, climate impacts on emergencies, extreme weather events, downpours, hurricanes, fires, and how we respond to that. The impacts of animals on our health and how it all fits together. And certainly our environmental, you know, protectors are also underfunded, just like our public health programs. But it really strikes me, you know, we talk about these things in our messaging, but aside from events like these, it does seem like a lot of this work is very siloed. So the main thing I wanted to say is that I think, you know, the more we can collaborate between these things moving forward and combining our shared, you know, knowledge to work together, the better. And I'm looking forward to doing that more and hope that across the state and really around the world, we can bring, you know, the public health experts and emergency management experts, environmental experts, you know, city planners, government, everyone together to, you know, come up with the solutions we actually need to fight these worsening problems.
Anything else from anyone? Sepi, anything to add?
I just wanted to mention that this importance of being able to speak across disciplines and across sectors, and that has been a challenge. I can tell you that in my work as a meteorologist and dealing with information technology, just even working with computer scientists that would put what we want to get across to the public for decision support has been a challenge. So I think we are getting closer in getting scientists to learn how to talk to people that are going to use the information that they're putting out, but we've come a long way, but we still have a lot to learn. And I think bringing in all the groups together in these integrated teams is really important. We've started to do that now, not just for climate change, but for high impact weather events. And these integrated teams really are miraculous, for lack of a better word, because they have people from every different sector talking to one another. And I don't think we do that often enough because, just like Flora said, we're still kind of mainly in silos. So that would be really something that we could do, whether that starts at the community level or at a higher level down, that would perhaps help.
Good, thank you. So I'm gonna skip ahead on the questions I sent out to you because this one sort of plays into another question. So near the end of the film, when she's talking about and visiting the site where they're doing the disaster preparedness, she identifies that disaster preparedness is a well-funded endeavor. And so that struck me as a pretty bold statement. So I just wondered, and I'm gonna go to Duane first and ask him if he feels that that is the case. And if, you know, why or why not? And then perhaps maybe are there other regional issues at play there as well?
I just have one word for you, Kelly: politics. You know, at the end of the day, and I believe Sepi mentioned this earlier, and maybe Flora and Ruth did also, but, you know, for every $1 you spend pre-disaster, depending on where you're looking, you're saving $7 to $15. And nobody wants to spend that money because you don't get the good photo ops at the disaster scene when you're out there, you know, hey, we came to save you after the disaster. And politicians are poor at giving money up front because what if the disaster never happens? But if the disaster happens, we show up, we got social media, we got the, you know, the visuals, right? Here we are, we're saving the day, we're at the disaster scene. And it really, it's just disheartening that we know the science, as Sepi will tell you, will prove that the money needs to be in pre-disaster mitigation. I will tell you that the current administration has already proposed spending millions and millions and millions of dollars in pre-disaster mitigation, but it hasn't been spent. The checks haven't been written yet. So, you know, hopefully we're finally turning that a little bit. Again, that's, you know, whether we're talking disasters as in natural disasters or disasters like what we see with the social vulnerabilities and these people that just don't have a chance currently, you know, we have got to do a better job. But I'll use the you know, it's just not glamorous enough, right? So the glamour is, you saw it. They had the big exercise, right? Look at the cars and the buildings that were crashed and everybody showed up and we're going to rescue everybody. It's just disheartening that we spend money on a lot of really ridiculous things in this nation, which we all know about, but yet we leave people in buildings in Chicago and all around the country to die because we don't want to put that money up forward when we want to plan for that. You know, not that that earthquake wouldn't be bad at the fault, but 1812, I think they said, was the last time it happened, right? You know, we're putting a lot of money into the Northwest right now for Cascadia. The last time it happened was 317 years ago or so. So it's unfortunate that, you know, politicians like to get that photo up. I guess that's anybody that's ever been in a class of mine knows that that's my sales pitch I use all the time, that's why we don't do a good job of pre-disaster mitigation.
So would you disagree then that disaster management is a well-funded endeavor?
Oh no, it gets a lot of money.
Okay, it just doesn't get money at the right spot.
Right, it gets a lot of money. I mean, so I'll just give you our 9-county region. Well, let me go backwards. Pre 9/11, there wasn't a lot of money in disaster management. After 9/11, the floodgates opened, but of course it was all what? Counterterrorism. Our 9-county region got some money for the first time from the feds in about 2003, 2004. And then we peaked somewhere around 2008, 2009. We were getting about $4 million a year from DHS for preparedness. Now, if you think about it, $4 million, and we got 2 million people so about $2 a person every year. But that number has dropped drastically as we get further away from 9/11. So the county, our 9-county region is getting about $1.3 million right now, and we have about 2.4 million people. So I don't have anything to compare it to as to, you know, what kind of money do we spend on other stuff. But yes, it's a lot of money, but no, it's not.
Right.
Yeah.
Ruth, from the, you know, because I mean, we know that over the past 15, I'm not sure what the actual time frame is in Pennsylvania when they just started slashing public health county public health departments. And, you know, and if those were in place now, we would have a very different story in terms of our response to COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Villanova University is in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And for the most part, I mean, it has some low-income communities, but it also has some of the wealthiest communities in the state. They had no health department. So I live in Chester County, and so Chester County right now is picking up it's running 2 county health departments because, you know, so yeah, and Duane is absolutely right. So the students in Duane's class, I just jabbed him a little bit, but he's been right. But anyway, so he's absolutely right. It's political, and I mean, I can use Delaware County as an example. The people that the leaders and the policymakers in that county managed to shift money to other things, a casino, a variety of things that were not as helpful actually to the people in the county. So, and now they've elected new people and brought them in. So, you know, our policymakers, it really does matter at the local, state, and national level, who's making the decisions, and then are we communicating with them? That's our responsibility to keep them informed.
Duane, I think I'm correct in saying that Lancaster County does not have a county public health office, correct?
That's correct, but our county commissioners decided to hire a public health person about 2 weeks ago.
About how many weeks ago? Just a couple weeks ago.
About 2 weeks ago.
Okay, good.
It's not we still don't have a public health department, but now we can say we have somebody that's going to deal with public health. One person, we have about 525,000 in the county. It seems like a pretty good ratio.
Yeah, I mean, and without any kind of support systems,
Correct.
To really, because it's also about having a seat at the table. So if you don't rate that level, and that's all where politics comes in as well. Flora, anything from the Oh, go ahead, Duane. Sorry.
I was just going to say, to Ruth's point, if you don't have a county department of health, the Pennsylvania Department of Health would not give you information on COVID patients. So we in Lancaster County were not privileged to who was being reported in the numbers because we didn't have a Department of Health. Right. And so again, one of those disconnects, the communication thing Ruth is talking about.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Flora.
Yeah, I mean, of course, as Duane and Ruth were just saying, a lot of these problems are political, and we run into that all the time with climate change, right? We know the problem of climate change. The science is very clear. We have solutions we could be implementing at a wide scale: renewable energy technology, emissions reduction technology, pollution reduction technology, electric vehicles. The list goes on and on and on. We have very smart people developing that technology. We have policies written that are just sitting on shelves. And the thing that's missing is the political will of our elected officials to actually implement those solutions. And I'm sure that plays out with disaster management and all these public health and all these other things that we're talking about. So that's why, our mission at Penn Environment is helping people make their voices heard to push forward these policy solutions. But of course, the question about funding is a great example of that. Our environmental department, Department of Environmental Protection, DEP in Pennsylvania, continues to get its budget slashed to the point where they can't even enforce a lot of our common sense protections. And it's very frustrating to hear, our elected officials say that doing this front end preventative stuff is too expensive, when really we know the health costs, the external costs of environmental pollution to our health, the costs of climate change even are far more expensive than doing this preventative stuff. So even just in 2020, climate related disasters caused $210 billion in damage. And I'm sure that's under, an underestimation. So if we admit that those are the huge costs associated with climate change as just one example, we should be investing that money into the solutions to prevent that from happening in the first place. And that's really what's still missing.
Oops, thank you, Flora. I'm going to ask one last question that I had, and then I'm going to start to go to some of the questions in the chat. So at the very end, or near the end of the movie, she describes the crisis that we saw in the movie, climate change and social determinants of health, as a disaster in slow motion. And again, that was one of those phrases that really just caught my attention, because it doesn't, when I think about how the United States as a society, how we responded after 9/11, that was a very different response.
The trumpet must
you can't make me wear that mask and those kind of things. So I'm wondering, do you, and she identifies that we need to enlarge the definition of disaster. What are your thoughts? Do you think that we do need to change how we define disaster and perhaps reprioritize how we, sort of do some of those things? Go ahead.
I early in my career, I was a visiting nurse in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, which is a primarily African-American community. And this was way before WHO coined the term social determinants of health, but that's kind of in the history anyway of nursing, of looking at those social issues. And so I finally, really saw, I had this, epiphany of how people live and the impact that it had on the development of chronic disease and the opportunities that weren't there for people living in West Philadelphia versus my family that was only 10 miles away. So, it absolutely is a slow moving disaster, and the way we report it is wrong. That we can't track it. So from the scientific point of view, because I, monitor health data, I can't say what is a climate related health threat. Now in Philadelphia, they do monitor, if we're looking at mortality, death from a climate event. They do monitor heat-related illness, so we can track it, but it's not typically monitored. So we can't even collect the right data for our policymakers. And so, that's something that we really need to, usually with our death certificates, that's how we get mortality data. It's the underlying cause that people die of. So, it's going to be heart disease or respiratory disease. It's not going to be heat, or it's not going to be, a flash flood. It may be drowning. It just depends. But it's very problematic to be able to quantify the human health impact of this, and that needs to change too.
And that was mentioned in the film where, they said, here's the death rate. But in fact, when they brought, they question, of course, they always want to question what the science or what the healthcare provider might say. Good. Other thoughts from anyone else about redefining or the idea of a disaster in slow motion?
Well, I think that, and somebody Christina put it in the thing, we got this whole shiny trucks thing. And, look at these big things and these great pictures, but we'll relate it to COVID, right? So who's getting the vaccine right now? Well, it's who you know, if you have the technological capability, where you live, right? I mean, it's the same issue, but what we know about disasters is that, COVID will eventually go away. It might not be another 30 years or something, but it's going to go away. And when it does, for a while, we'll stockpile all the things right now that we can't get the mask and the ventilators and all these things. And then all of a sudden we'll have this memory loss and it'll just kind of fade away. And that's what happens. But the reality of it is that it's just a matter of, I don't want to take up again the pulling the boots up, but but he said something, I think it was him, and it might have been the other gentleman, said something very important. It's the law. This is what disaster management can do. I mean, there are things that we can spend DHS money on, and there's things we can't. And until government changes what we're allowed to spend money on, that's the gap in the system. So she's correct in that this too is a disaster. What's happening, these vulnerable populations, that in itself is a disaster every day, everywhere in this country. But the laws don't allow you to do what needs to be done to solve the problem. And that's where we need to get people like Florida convince our legislators and all of us to get on board. Somebody asked the question, how do you move forward? Well, you move forward by convincing your elected officials that the law has to be changed.
Good. That's a great point, because we can only spend money where it's permitted to be spent. Flora or Sepi has her mute off.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the importance of advocacy at all levels. I think it's critical. I think many times we want to sit back and wait for, or big organizations to push certain things forward. But I really think that advocacy, even at the individual level, is important. And just as a sort of this slow moving disaster, I think climate change is certainly the best example for a slow moving disaster. And now there are lots of papers that are being written on, for example, more droughts and how droughts are having significant impacts on people's mental health. And as a result of climate change, because they're ongoing, they're long lasting, but people don't seem to look at them because it's not the big tornado or the big tropical storm and so forth. So I think it's an important concept, but I just want to push for advocacy. Very important.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's vital. Go ahead, Flora.
I was just going to say, yes, love these pushes for advocacy. That's what I'm all about. And certainly, I totally agree with Sepi that climate change is, the disaster in slow motion. We know that it's happening. We have the solutions to fix it, but because it's still, though it's getting more and more tangible, the impacts are here for a lot of folks. It still seems like a distant problem or an intangible problem. And so it really is up to all of us on this call, everyone you know, making your voices heard to your elected officials at every level, local, state, federal, about the issues you care about, whether that's changing, what can qualify for disaster relief, better public health policies, or in our case, tackling climate change, moving towards a 100% renewable energy future. We really do need you to be calling and writing and emailing those legislators, because that's the only way that we collectively can push them forward and implement these solutions. And certainly I have ways that you can get involved that hopefully I'll have time to plug at the end, but definitely advocacy is very important in order to actually get this stuff moving.
Great. So we have two sort of related questions in the chat. One is from Christina, who's one of my brand new MSN students. And then one is from Karen Rice. And so Christina says, moving forward, how might each of you plan to target the issues of social justice or barriers in your own community? And in a similar vein, Karen asks, as we wait for sort of the macro or policy changes, what can we do within our own communities to try to increase resilience? So, sort of that, what are those grassroots things that can be done now, other than making sure that, after my son took Duane's emergency management 201 class, we are stocked up and prepared, we're ready. But other than that, what other things can we do, especially in terms of resilience? How do we increase resilience? I'm going to look at you, Ruth.
Answer them separately, if that's okay. Because
yes.
When I saw Christina's question, there's something that's been bugging me, I guess. It's bugged me for a long time, but it's become more clear with the racial events that have occurred and what we need to do. And I alluded to education earlier, and I'm sure you know that in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure it's probably the same across the country, but I do know in Pennsylvania, the way public education is paid for is by real estate taxes. And so if you've got a low income community, then they don't get as much money, and then it needs to come from the state or the feds. And so they're kind of at the mercy. And so that's one of the reasons that the education is so poor in poor communities. And so I would like to change that. And so that's kind of a bigger wish, but it's state level, and we can do it with enough willpower, I think. But it would take a lot. But I think it should be, every school should get the same amount of funding so that every child has the same opportunities. And then in time, the social determinants would go away. And I know that sounds, I know that in my community, they won't go for that. But I think we need to do it because of the issues that we see and for equity. And then for the micro level kind of in my community, what we can do. And there was a comment about cars. I would like to see more active transportation because if we can ride our bikes, and I should have had my other background that I use a lot because I was in Finland. They ride their bikes year round. They just put snow tires on their bikes and just keep going. So if you walk or can ride your bike places, and I know that's not always reasonable, especially if you live in a rural area, it can be quite a distance and roads might not be safe. But if we can think about how to make it happen in communities that can do it, you are getting exercise and air quality is improved. It's less emissions. And so where I live, that's what I'm trying to promote. It kind of hits the climate change, it hits on better health. That's what I'll stick with.
I think that from a local level, if you think about resiliency and some of the disaster mitigation things that we talk about, the flooding and whatnot, it's all local issues. So when you think about it, land use planning, zoning, those are local things. So if you can advocate in your local community to make sure that you have good land use planning, good zoning, so you can build a resilient community, right? Let's if we go back to what happened in the film, if you look at what happened in Katrina, where were they most affected? In the neighborhoods that were the most vulnerable. So how can we protect those neighborhoods? Well, we have to have better land use planning. We have to have better zoning laws. And that's the things we can push from the local level, because those things don't come from the federal level. Federal level is where we get the money. The problem, and I saw Mark's question about who all collaborates together. It would be nice to say that you get, public health and emergency management together. Most local emergency managers, especially in Pennsylvania, they're running pencil thin. They're spread out with a lot of jobs and very little money, and they don't get very good financing. So to your point, Mark, it would be nice to get everybody, and Ruth used one of my most favorite terms about playing in the sandbox together, right? And so how do we do that? And to whomever asked the question, Brianna, about how do we help our most vulnerable populations? Well, when you do the exercises and the training, you should make sure that you involve them. When you start doing, as Ruth said, the school education, right? We know that our habits are formed very young, right? So if we can start to form those good habits and get children, when they first get into the school systems, even maybe into pre-K, start to teach them then about resiliency, start to teach them then about disaster preparedness, so that they grow up with it. It's what they understand. I think Sepi made a great point with climate change, right? It's not going to affect me. It's way out there in the distance somewhere. But the hurricane or the flood or the fire might, be today. So people like to kick the can down the road. I believe it's a habits and generational change. And the only way to do that is we need it's going to take multiple generations. We're not going to change it overnight, but we have to start in the schools. I think Ruth's point is excellent. That's we spend a lot of time teaching kids how to take tests, but we don't teach them how to survive. And I'll stop with that. I'll pass the ball.
Yeah, other thought. I will agree. I mean, I can remember in grade school, there was a lot more discussion about, there was Smokey the Bear to begin with, but like there was a lot more discussion of like what would happen if there was a fire in your house. You had a plan, and I don't remember my kids ever really talking about that. And there's even more stuff they need to think about now. And so I do think we need more education in that area. Flora, you want to say something?
Yes, I had a couple thoughts. One thing is climate change is another great example of something that we need to be teaching kids from a younger age. Certainly already across the country, young people are leading the climate movement. They see how it'll impact their lives. But Pennsylvania is among the bottom of the barrel of states in terms of climate, environmental education in schools. I'm sure emergency preparedness education as well. And so we do need to, institutionalize that curriculum and make sure it's being taught. A couple other thoughts I had. One is just the importance of building community across all of these things, right? If we actually are getting to know our neighbors and can help one another out when there's a disaster, but also building those communities to then do advocacy, right? Getting your neighbors together to go to your local or state government to advocate for some of this stuff and build resiliency that way is so important, especially as these disasters continue and climate change worsens. And then the last thing I was thinking was, of course, there's things we can do in the short term to improve resiliency, help people. The city of Philadelphia has an interesting toolkit about community like heat alleviation. I just put in the chat, which certainly could be modeled elsewhere as just one example. But then again, with climate change, we really do need also to be thinking about the forward-looking solutions, right? If our bathtub's overflowing with water, you don't just start bailing it out, you turn off the tap first. So we need to think about how we can stop these fossil fuel emissions in the first place and do that kind of policy advocacy to stop these impacts from worsening. And I know that's a lot and it's a tall order and there's so many different things we need to do. So I just encourage everyone on the call to think about the thing that resonates most with you, that you're most passionate about, and make your voice heard about that issue and build community with others that care about, their issues, and we can work together to push it all forward together.
Yes, I'm sure you'll love to hear, Flora, well, the whole panel, that when my son was in 7th grade, it was part of the social studies curriculum to talk about climate change. And this is exactly how it was presented. Yeah, I have to talk about this. It's not actually real, so you shouldn't believe in it, but here's what I'm going to tell you. So you can imagine my particular response to that teacher. So we don't speak to this day. been a few years. Yeah, so we've had a couple other questions or comments in the chat. So there, and Flora, maybe you can discuss this a little bit too. So Quinn mentioned, sort of the impact of electric cars and the batteries and all those sorts of things. I know that there's been work done looking at sort of that risk-benefit ratio. Do you have any additional information you can provide there?
Yeah, there's I think there's a lot more evidence that the net benefit of things like electric cars is still positive, even with that resource extraction, just in terms of emissions and pollution that way. But certainly, like electric cars, like everyone just driving an electric car is actually not the solution. So I'd echo what Ruth said, that we need to get more people walking and biking and developing infrastructure like protected bike lanes and more walkable cities that allow that to happen. We need to expand and electrify our public transit so that everyone can use public transit together. Certainly, European countries do a lot better job at all three of those things. So I do think that we need electric vehicles over gas vehicles, and we need to put policies in place to protect the communities where that mining for resources is happening. But that's not the silver bullet, and we really need to be having more walkable, bikeable, cities as well. But it is a lot of, cost benefit analysis and all of this stuff. And I would say, don't believe the first source you read, because certainly there's some articles out there about how, renewable energy is actually worse than fossil fuels. When you dig into it, that's not true. But we need a, wide variety of solutions.
Great. And then we have another one, and this may sort of go between some policy things also. Gabriella mentions that poverty alleviation, addressing poverty, and we're seeing that a lot in politics right now, and looking at the potential to increase the minimum wage significantly, because the reality is minimum wage was never meant to be the livable wage. It was just something they put in place. Could likely be one of the more positive solutions to all of that. So I don't know if anybody, that's sort of going a little far afield of where we are, but maybe somebody has a comment about that.
Yeah, I would go back to education.
Yeah.
And I know we can't import Finland to the United States because we are two very, very different cultures. But their example of education is one that we should look at and think about how we could accept it in some way that worked for the United States. But their system, the children go through the typical elementary, and then in high school, actually, it divides out based on test scores, which I thought would never fly in the United States. But when you get into post-secondary education, so you can either go to a trade program or essentially the equivalent of an associate's degree or a 4-year college. But along those tracks, you can always, even if you did the trade program, there's some of those, it is set up so that you can then go on and do a 4-year degree without having to start at the 4-year degree all over again. Like, it's just designed so it's almost seamless if people want to move on in their education. And not to say that there's anything wrong with the trade program, but so we need to think about that again, giving opportunities for people who are from underserved and low-income communities. And then, kind of a side note, and it hasn't come up, but we've talked a little bit about place at the table. I'm now at the point where when I'm asked to serve on a board or something, I look at who is on the board, and if they don't have enough ethnic or racial diversity or any other kind of diversity, I step back and recommend somebody else. Because one of the things in that film that was, to me, very evident is all the decision makers were a bunch of white people. And so again, it's kind of that not understanding the issues for other people. So, that's another way that we can somebody said something about the injustices. That's another way we can advocate, is stepping aside and letting somebody else have a voice.
So what I would like to do, we're just about at the end of our time, and I want to make sure I give Shana and Karen enough time to wrap up. But if you wanted to provide us with any final thoughts or a plug for anything that moving forward, I'll start with Flora.
Thank you. Yes, I do have a quick plug. I'm sure after listening to this, all of you are, really wondering how you can get involved and make your voice heard for climate action in Pennsylvania. And there's a couple things I wanted to flag that I'll put in the chat too. So one, Penn Environment is a statewide people-powered environmental advocacy organization. And our whole deal is helping people make their voice heard to their elected officials. And one of the easiest ways that you can get involved in that is joining our mobile action network. It's a very easy, a couple times a month, not too frequent text program where my friend Kelly, our digital organizer, a real person, will text you a couple times a month if there's a bill that you need to call your elected official about to either push forward or stop or to invite you to an event. So it's a great way to stay updated, and you can join that by texting the word PA climate to the number 21333. Follow the prompt so we direct your calls or emails to the right elected official. But that's a great way to kind of cut through some of the noise in Harrisburg and know what's happening at the state level and take a quick action, sign a petition, send an email, make a call to, get your elected official to take action on urgent bills or to come to educational events. So again, text PA climate to 21333. And then the second thing is that we are hosting a webinar tomorrow night, actually, with State Senator Katie Muth, who's the Senate Democratic Policy Chair, discussing environmental policy and priorities for this session, totally free on Zoom, 6 to 7. And you can RSVP at this link in the chat if you're interested in learning more about environmental policy specifically, plus hearing from Senator Muth, who's a huge environmental champion. And then certainly if you're interested in, getting involved, volunteering more, feel free to shoot me an email. I'll put that in the chat as well. But really, even if environment's not your issue, whatever the issue is, just, we need you to be an advocate and make your voices heard.
Thank you, Flora. Sepi, you've been quiet for a long time.
It's okay. I'm learning a lot listening. I think it's one of the things that I think we're always afraid of is not to learn about issues that we don't know about and say, science is not my thing, advocacy is not my thing, education is not my thing. And I just think that it's really important for us to kind of not be afraid to not only educate ourselves and advocate for ourselves, then that empowers us to do it for others and kind of spread this out. So a lot of people have asked about how do you get involved? I think just even in your own community, this idea of, resilience tools are something that we can move forward with. So I just wanted to say that because I think a lot of people are afraid of, I don't understand climate change. I don't understand this or that. And I think educating ourselves is the first step. So.
No, I want to take your climate class now, Sepi.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be on this panel.
Ruth.
I had to mute. My dog decided to wake up and bark.
At least it wasn't a trumpet.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. I think kind of the parting words, first of all, yes, we have to be involved. And so find where you're comfortable and you will find you grow in that, and then you get even more brave and engage in other ways. But what we have seen with COVID-19 is really the same vulnerabilities and issues related to climate change. And so, the overlap is really striking, and in public health, when it was kind of the virus was coming around, we knew that this was going to happen. And so in a sense, it's a wake-up call for everybody. So now we can start having these conversations, which are so important. Look at how these issues, what affects one of us affect all of us. So look at how whatever may excite you in this discussion, whether it be, biking more, walking more, or getting involved in education, or even just talking to friends about these issues and getting them engaged and get engaged as a group. That's all really valuable. So, and again, thank you for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to talk with you all.
Thank you, Ruth. Yeah. And again, I said at the beginning, I feel like every time we've done something with an environmental focus at Millersville, we tend to have a really good turnout of people. So I think Sepi and Duane and I need to put our heads together on some more stuff. Duane, you get the last laugh.
I couldn't unmute. Sorry. So I get the last 30 minutes.
Yep.
So
You can have an hour if you want it.
an hour. Thanks. So I think it really comes down to three things, and it's kind of been mentioned here. And I'll go back to Mark's point about who do we get involved. And I think Brianna asked, who do we get involved? We need to, as wide a net as we can cast. You know, it doesn't matter if you're emergency manager, if you're a public health worker, if you're the person that works at the local sewer plant, or wherever that may be, right? We can't limit our stakeholders. So when we're gathering the masses to make our point, we need to make sure that we have as many people involved as possible. So that's point one. Point two is that ultimately, don't be blinded by people that don't want you to see the root causes. Too often somebody, you know, throws out a little smoke and mirrors and goes, oh, here's the problem. Well, that's find the root cause when you're looking at these issues and the problem, because the root cause is, when you trace back to the root cause, you're going to find it's not what's usually, you know, being thrown out there publicly. And then the last thing, and it goes back to what everybody else has said, is I think one of the most interesting parts of the film was when she spoke to the two people in Kentucky, and she said something to the effect of, she made them very uncomfortable. She made them very uncomfortable. And here's what I'm going to tell you as the future: don't keep yourself in a box. Get outside that comfort zone. Do things, you know, you could say, I don't like public speaking, or I don't want like advocacy, whatever it is, throw that all away. If you want to change the future, get outside your comfort zone and go do it. So those are my 3 points to end with. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for listening. We all made up, so it's all good. We're all good now. So
I would just echo what everyone said. You know, I tell my students all the time, public elected officials are just that. They are your elected officials, and it is your responsibility to talk to them. And many of them, especially at the state level, will tell you that if they hear from 10 people on a particular issue, that can be a lot. And that can mean that, oh, this must be a big deal. And so it's not, I have my representative's cell phone number because she will text me and ask me a question about healthcare things. And we may be of different political affiliations, but yet we can still have those conversations. And in non-COVID times, you can go there and you can walk into their office, and you may not always talk to that person. I know I've done with Annie, I've ended up doing a lot of work at the federal level as well. And, you know, I went into Senator Toomey's office and asked to talk about the environment, and they weren't real thrilled to see me. But Wesley, the aide, he listened to me. He wrote some things down. Senator Casey's office is far more willing to talk to you about those things. But all the same, you still have to let your voice be heard, and you need, and I feel like it's really our civic response. You know, it's our responsibility as citizens to do that. And so it's not as scary. I make all my students talk to their representatives, and they figure out that it's not near as scary as everybody thinks it is. So I would like to personally thank all of the panelists. I consider each of you a friend, and I think you did a great job, but I don't think anybody really had to make up. There was just, so I'm going to turn it back to either Shana or Karen from the Learning Institute to wrap us up here.
Yes, thank you. And from the Learning Institute, we also just want to thank everyone for joining this call tonight, and collectively having your voices just educate more on this issue, and also speak about ways that we can all get involved. I do want to let everyone know that the link that I sent out for the film is actually still going to be available for a couple of days. So if you want to kind of use that as a tool to start a conversation with someone else, you can feel free to share that link. We do have that as a resource, and I'll also send it in the follow-up email so you have it. I'm also in the chat putting a survey that we'd love to have your input about this event. And a quick plug for those receiving continuing education credits, you have to complete the survey at some point in time. So again, I'll put some of this information in the follow-up email, but I just want to make sure that you guys knew it off the bat.
Shayna, I'm sorry, would you be able to include all of Flora's links in your follow-up email as well?
Yeah, I'll collect kind of resources from all the panelists as well, and we can send that out. Yeah.
And then just for my nursing students that are on the call, the continuing ed is really mainly for social work, correct?
Yes, we are just for the social work side of continuing education. Maybe someday we'll expand. But
well,
yeah,
we've done some collaborative stuff before. We'll get that moving again.
yeah, that's great. But yeah, so just keep your eye out also for Learning Institute events. We love to put together events like this for all of you. But that's all we have. Thank you again and have a good night.